It was the summer of 2003, and Daniel Hartwell thought he knew exactly what he was doing. He had been hiking for over 15 years by that point, had done trails across 6 different states, and considered himself more than capable of handling anything the wilderness could throw at him. He lived in a small town just outside Kanab, Utah, with his wife Sarah and their 2 kids, a 9-year-old boy named Caleb and a 7-year-old girl named Emma. Every summer, without fail, he would pack the family up and take them somewhere remote, somewhere most people wouldn't bother going. That was the whole point for Daniel. He didn't want crowded trails and tourist spots. He wanted real nature. That July, he had heard about an unmarked trail near the edges of Zion National Park. Not on any official map, not maintained by the Park Service, just a route that certain locals knew about. A colleague of his named Ron had mentioned it once, almost in passing, and Daniel had latched onto the idea immediately. He asked Ron for more details. Ron gave him a vague description of how to get to the trailhead, but then immediately followed it up with a warning. He told Daniel that there was absolutely no cell signal out there, that the terrain was deceptive, that distances looked much shorter than they actually were because of the way the land opened up, and that more than one experienced hiker had gotten turned around in that area and needed rescuing. He told him plainly, "Do not take your family out there without a proper GPS device and at least a gallon of water per person." Daniel nodded, thanked him, and then did almost none of that. He brought 2 water bottles for a family of 4. He had an old compass that he had owned since college but hadn't seriously used in years. He did not bring a GPS device because he didn't own one and didn't think he needed one. He told Sarah it was a day trip, that they would be back by evening, that it was nothing more than a few hours of easy walking through beautiful scenery. Sarah was not entirely comfortable with the plan. She asked him more than once if he was sure about the route, if he had a proper map, if maybe they should stick to the official Zion trails instead. Daniel told her she was overthinking it. He had done harder things than this. They set out on the morning of July 14th. The first 2 hours were genuinely pleasant. The landscape was stunning in that particular way that the Utah desert is stunning. All red rock and silence and open sky. Caleb kept picking up stones and asking his father what kind they were, and Daniel, in a good mood, would make up names for them. Emma had fallen asleep against Sarah's shoulder for part of the walk. It felt like exactly the kind of trip Daniel had promised. Then he spotted the ridge. It was off to the right of where they were walking, a natural elevated formation that he was convinced would give them a clear view of the surrounding area and allow him to orient himself more precisely. More than that, he had a feeling, just a feeling, that cutting across toward it and going over would put them on a faster path back. Sarah immediately said no. She said they were making good time on the route they had, that they had water for maybe another hour of walking, and that going off the known path to chase a shortcut made no sense. Daniel heard all of this and decided to go anyway. He told her it was close, maybe 20 minutes, and that the view from up there would be worth it. What Daniel did not fully account for is something that experienced desert navigators know well. In the open terrain of the American Southwest, distances are consistently and dramatically underestimated by the human eye. What looks like it is a 20-minute walk away is often an hour and a half. The ridge that Daniel pointed to confidently took them nearly 2 hours to reach, and by the time they got there the sun was high and brutal and the first water bottle was already gone. When they crossed the ridge and looked out at what was on the other side, there was no trail. There was no recognizable landmark. There was another wide valley of rocky desert scrub stretching out in every direction, and it looked more or less identical to what they had already walked through. Daniel stood there for a moment, not saying anything. Sarah did not say, "I told you so." She just looked at him and then looked at the children. He tried to use the compass, but without a map, it only told him direction, not position. He knew roughly which way was north, but that meant very little when he didn't know where they were relative to where they needed to go. He picked a direction based on instinct, and they started walking again. The temperature that afternoon reached 106 degrees Fahrenheit. The second water bottle was finished within the hour. Emma stopped talking and started dragging her feet. Caleb complained his head hurt, which is one of the early signs of heat exhaustion in children, though Daniel didn't recognize it as such in the moment. By late afternoon, Daniel made the decision to stop moving and find shelter from heat. He found a low, rocky outcropping that cast enough shadow for all four of them to sit under, and told Sarah he was going to climb the rocks to get a better view of the area. Sarah told him to be careful. He started climbing, and about 12 feet up on a section of rock that looked solid but had been weakened by years of thermal expansion and contraction, his footing gave way. He fell sideways and came down on his left leg across a sharp edge of stone. The cut was deep, running from just below the knee almost to the ankle. It bled heavily. Sarah tore strips from her shirt and wrapped the wound as tightly as she could. The children watched without speaking. That night the temperature dropped sharply, as it does in the desert, and with no blankets and wet clothes from sweating all day, all four of them were cold and shaking within a few hours. Nobody slept properly. Daniel's leg had swollen noticeably by morning, and the skin around the wound was starting to look wrong, slightly discolored, warm to the touch even in the cold air. They spent 3 days out there. 3 days with no food beyond a few snack bars they had brought for the kids, no clean water, and an open wound on Daniel's leg that was visibly worsening. On the second day, Sarah found a shallow depression in the rock that had collected some rainwater, and they drank it without having any way to purify it because they had no choice. On the third morning, Caleb was too weak to walk properly, and Daniel could barely put weight on his left leg. Sarah kept the children close to her and tried to keep them calm, telling them in a quiet voice that people were looking for them, that help was coming. Help did come, but not because of anything they did. It came because of a hotel receptionist named Maria, who had been working the desk at the small motel in Kanab, where the Hartwells had checked in 2 nights before the hike. When she noticed they hadn't checked out on time and their car was still in the lot, she flagged it to her manager. Their manager recognized the car registration had been noted when they checked in and contacted local authorities, who then contacted search and rescue. A helicopter found them on the afternoon of the 3rd day. Emma had passed out from dehydration. Daniel's leg wound had developed a serious infection that required 3 weeks of hospital treatment and left a scar he still has today. In an interview Sarah gave to a local Utah paper a year later, she said the moment that stayed with her the most was not the fear, not the thirst, not even watching her children suffer. It was the first night when Emma had woken up in the dark and quietly asked her, without any drama, just very simply and directly, whether they were going to die out there. And Sarah said she had looked at her daughter and opened her mouth and genuinely did not know what to say. Daniel had made several mistakes, each one compounding the last. He ignored a direct warning from someone who knew the area. He brought nowhere near enough water. He took an unmarked route without proper navigation tools. And then when things started going wrong, He kept making active decisions that made the situation worse rather than better. Individually, any one of those mistakes might have been manageable. Together, they almost killed his entire family. Now, the next story I want to tell you is completely different in almost every way. No desert, no physical landscape, no visible danger at the start. This one begins with something most of us do without thinking twice. Something so ordinary it barely registers. It begins with clicking a link in an email. Ji-woo Park was 26 years old and living alone in a small apartment in the Mapo district of Seoul, South Korea, in the spring of 2017. She worked at a mid-sized marketing firm, kept mostly to herself, and had the kind of quiet, orderly life that doesn't attract much attention. She wasn't particularly active on social media, didn't share much online, and considered herself reasonably careful about digital security. She wasn't careless. That's important to understand going in. She wasn't someone who clicked on everything without thinking. She was just a normal, intelligent person who made one mistake at the wrong time. Late on a Tuesday evening, she was at her desk finishing up a project when an email came in. The sender's name was Park Soo-hyun, a woman she'd been close friends with in college but had drifted away from over the years. They hadn't spoken in almost 2 years. The message was short and a little vague. It said something along the lines of, "Ji-woo, I've run into a bit of a problem and I need some help. Could you click this link and fill out a short form? I'll explain more later. Thank you so much." Ji-woo hesitated for a moment. The message was a little odd, a little abrupt, but she reasoned that Soo-hyun had always been someone who communicated in shorthand, and if there was a problem, maybe she was stressed and just needed a quick favor. She clicked the link. A page loaded that looked exactly like a standard Google sign-in screen. Clean, familiar, the right colors, the right fonts, a small Google logo in the corner. It asked her to verify her identity to continue. She typed in her Gmail address and her password and pressed enter. Nothing happened. The page seemed to refresh and then just sat there. She assumed it was a broken link or a technical error, closed the tab and went back to her work. She sent Soo-hyun a quick message saying she had tried but something seemed wrong with the link. Soo-hyun replied within minutes, saying she had no idea what Ji-woo was talking about, that she hadn't sent any email, that her own email account had actually been acting strangely for the past few days. Ji-woo felt a slow, cold feeling settle in her stomach. She went to log into her Gmail account. The password didn't work. She tried the recovery option and found that the recovery email address associated with her account had been changed to one she didn't recognize. The backup phone number had also been changed. She was locked out completely, within what appeared to be the time it had taken her to type her password into a fake web page and press enter. What had happened was textbook. Someone had compromised Soo-hyun's account first, harvested her contact list, and then sent out phishing emails to everyone on it, knowing that people were far more likely to click a link that appeared to come from someone they knew. The fake Google page was convincing enough that even someone paying reasonable attention could miss it. And once Ji-woo had typed in her credentials, they were captured and used immediately, not in hours, in minutes. But here is where it stops being a story about a phishing scam and becomes something considerably more disturbing. Ji-woo's Gmail account was the kind of central hub that most people's email accounts are without them fully realizing it. Her LinkedIn was connected to it. Her company's internal communication portal used it as a login. 2 of her bank accounts had it listed as a recovery option. And years of emails sat inside it, years of correspondence with colleagues, with clients, with friends and family, containing attachments, addresses, personal details, financial documents and photographs that she had never thought twice about storing there because why would she? Over the next 72 hours, whoever had access to that account went through it methodically. They did not do anything obvious or dramatic right away. They read, they gathered, they learned exactly who Jiwoo was, who she worked with, what her professional relationships looked like, and how she communicated. 4 days after the initial attack, Jiwoo was called into her manager's office. He was a calm man generally, not prone to visible agitation, but when she walked in, he was clearly uncomfortable. He told her that several of the company's regular clients had received emails from Jiwoo's account over the past few days. The emails were professional in tone, formatted correctly, and referenced specific ongoing projects in ways that suggested genuine knowledge of those projects. They informed the clients that due to a banking system update, outstanding invoices needed to be settled to a new account number, and they provided that number. 5 clients had already made payments. The total amount transferred was the equivalent of roughly $23,000. Jiwoo told him she hadn't sent those emails. He believed her, but the money was already gone, transferred through a series of accounts across multiple countries, and recovering it was going to be at best a long legal process, and at worst, impossible. The company began an internal investigation. Jiwoo had to provide her devices for examination, answer questions about her security practices, and work under the unspoken cloud of suspicion that hangs over someone even when people believe them but can't fully prove their innocence. That alone would have been enough to qualify as a nightmare, but there was one more layer that Jiwoo only discovered weeks later. Going through what she could reconstruct of the account activity, with help from a cybersecurity consultant the company brought in, she found that before the attacker had used her account to send those fraudulent invoices, they had spent time doing something else. They had gone through several years of her personal emails and extracted everything that could be used as leverage. Old messages where she had vented about colleagues. A period 2 years earlier where she had been struggling with anxiety and had emailed a close friend in detail about it. Some photographs that were not scandalous by any real measure but were personal in ways she would not have chosen to share publicly. All of it had been quietly copied and stored somewhere she had no access to. She never received a blackmail demand. Whoever had done this simply held on to that material and did nothing with it, at least not that she ever knew of. And Jiwoo said afterward that in some ways that was the worst part. Not knowing what they had, not knowing what they intended, not knowing whether one day she would receive a message telling her to send money or watch her private life get scattered across the internet. The threat that never arrived but also never fully went away. She changed every password she owned, set up 2-factor authentication on everything, switched to a new email address, and eventually moved to a different apartment. Even though she knew rationally that moving had nothing to do with digital security. She said it just felt like something she needed to do, like she needed to physically be somewhere that felt clean again. The thing that made this story land so heavily when I first came across it is that Jiwoo did not do anything stupid. She was not being reckless. She was a careful, private person who received what appeared to be an email from a friend she trusted and responded to it the way most people would. The attack worked precisely because it was designed to exploit trust rather than carelessness. And that one moment, that one click on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday night unraveled something that took her years to fully recover from. The last story I want to tell you tonight is different again. No desert, no fishing attack. This one is set in a house, a specific house, and it involves a family who made a decision that most people in their position would have understood. even if in hindsight it is almost impossible to explain how they let it go on as long as it did. In 2009, a couple named Gary and Pauline Fletcher bought an older home in a rural part of Lancashire in the north of England. They had 3 children, 2 teenage boys and a younger daughter, and they had been looking for something with more space, more land, somewhere the kids could grow up with a bit of room around them. The house was large, built in the 1930s, and had been on the market for a while. It needed work. The price reflected that. They bought it with the intention of renovating gradually and settling in for the long term. Almost immediately after moving in, small things started going wrong in a way that the family attributed initially to the age of the house. Doors that didn't close properly, a smell in the lower hallway that came and went without explanation. The boiler made sounds that their heating engineer said he couldn't fully account for. Their youngest, a girl named Lily, who was 8 at the time, told her mother within the first week that she didn't like the room at the end of the upstairs corridor and didn't want to walk past it alone. Gary told her it was just because the house was unfamiliar and she would get used to it. Pauline was not so sure but didn't push it. After about 3 weeks, Gary began noticing that things in the house were occasionally not where he had left them. Not dramatically moved, not vanished, just slightly off. A pair of glasses on the wrong side of the desk. A kitchen chair pulled out when he was sure he had pushed it in. He mentioned it to Pauline, who said she had noticed the same kind of thing a couple of times but assumed she had simply misremembered. They agreed they were probably both just disoriented from the move. Then one evening in November, about 2 months after they had moved in, Gary came home from work and found the back door unlocked. He was certain he had locked it that morning. He checked the house carefully and found nothing obviously disturbed or missing. He put it down to Pauline or one of the kids having gone out through the back and forgotten to lock up. He mentioned it that night over dinner. Everyone at the table said they hadn't used the back door that day. Gary replaced the lock on the back door. 2 weeks later, he found a window on the ground floor left open. Again, nobody in the family admitted to having opened it. He started paying closer attention. He began doing small things to test his own perception, leaving a chair at a precise angle and checking later whether it had moved, putting a thin strip of tape across a rarely used door at ankle height to see if it was disturbed. Most of these things came back normal, but not all of them. In January, Pauline was alone in the house during the afternoon when she heard what she later described as a low, repetitive sound coming from somewhere below the main floor. She assumed it was the boiler again and went down to the utility room to check. The boiler was off. She stood in the utility room for a moment listening, and the sound had stopped. She went back upstairs and tried to put it out of her mind. She did not tell Gary that evening. She wasn't sure why. She said later that she thought if she said it out loud, she would have to decide what to do about it, and she didn't want to have to do that yet. That impulse to not say it out loud, to not make it real by acknowledging it, is something that ran through this family's behavior for the next several months. Each of them individually was registering something wrong. Each of them had their own collection of small moments that they couldn't explain, and they kept those moments mostly to themselves, or mentioned them casually and let them dissolve in the ordinary noise of family life. In February, their older son, 17-year-old Marcus, told his parents he had heard someone walking in the hallway outside his room in the middle of the night. He had assumed it was his younger brother going to the bathroom and hadn't thought much of it until it happened again, 3 nights in a row. always at roughly the same time, around 2 in the morning. He checked the second time and his brother's door was closed, the light off, and when he asked in the morning, his brother said he had slept straight through the night. Marcus told his parents this, and Gary said it was probably just the house settling. Old houses creak and groan in particular ways, and Marcus accepted this because he wanted to accept it. The following month, Lily refused to sleep in her room. She would not explain exactly why in a way that made complete sense, only that she felt like someone was looking at her from the window, even though her window faced the back garden and was on the first floor. They let her sleep in her parents' room for a while, and then moved her into her brother's room, and she seemed calmer. It was March when Gary found the first concrete evidence that something was genuinely wrong, and it was so simple and so obvious in retrospect that the family found it very difficult to explain how they had gone so many months without discovering it. He had gone down to the cellar to look for a box of old photographs they still hadn't unpacked. The cellar was large, partially divided, and they had not used it much because it was damp and the lighting was poor. He had a torch with him. He was moving along the far wall looking at the stacked boxes when the torchlight caught something on the ground that stopped him immediately. There were marks in the dust, not random marks, prints, clear, deliberate footprints moving from behind a wooden partition at the back of the cellar toward the stairs. They were not from work boots or trainers. They were from shoes with a smooth, flat sole. Gary stood very still for a moment. Then he walked around the wooden partition. Behind it was a small, cleared space, not large enough to stand upright, but large enough to sit or lie down in. There was a sleeping bag, a plastic bag containing some food, mostly crackers and tinned items, an empty water bottle, a battery-powered torch of the same type Gary himself had been replacing the batteries in every few weeks. Batteries that kept going dead faster than he thought they should. Someone had been living in their cellar. The police were called. A search of the property and surrounding area was conducted. The person who had been in the cellar was not found that day, but based on evidence gathered, it was clear that someone had been accessing the house through the ground floor window Gary had found open in January, possibly through the back door before he had replaced the lock, and had been using the cellar as a base while the family lived directly above. How long this had been going on before the Fletchers had even moved in was impossible to determine. How many nights this person had been in that house while the family slept above them. How many times they had moved quietly through the rooms. How close they had come to the children. None of that was ever fully established. The detail that Gary came back to repeatedly in the aftermath, the one he said kept him awake for months, was the torch batteries. He had been replacing the batteries in his own torch in the cellar several times over the winter because they kept draining. He had assumed it was the cold affecting the battery's performance. It had not been the cold. Someone had been using his torch. Every strange thing the family had experienced suddenly had an explanation. The moved glasses, the unlocked doors, the sounds at night, the footsteps in the hallway at 2 in the morning. None of it had been the house settling. None of it had been imagination or the disorientation of a new home. They had been sharing that house with a stranger for months, and at every turn, when the evidence was right there in front of them, they had found a more comfortable explanation and chosen that instead. Not because they were foolish, because the truth was something their minds kept pulling back from. A person was eventually identified and charged, though the legal details that followed were complicated, and I won't go into all of them here. What stayed with the family, what the Fletcher case is often cited for in discussions of home security and what's sometimes called normalcy bias, is how ordinary every single warning sign looked when it appeared on its own. A door, a window, a sound, a feeling a child couldn't articulate. Not one of those things standing alone would have alarmed any reasonable person. Together, they were a map that the family was reading every day without recognizing what it was showing them. And that, more than anything, is what makes this kind of story sit with you long after you've finished hearing it. Not a monster, not something supernatural, just a very ordinary set of moments that everyone involved wished, desperately and too late, that they had taken more seriously.